the hidden Targaryen legacy in King's Landing, the Targaryen dynasty's architectural legacy. Did you know that every stone in King's Landing tells a story of fire and blood that most people walk past every single day without even realizing it? Right now, as you watch this video, there are hidden Targaryen secrets embedded in the very foundations of the capital city that have survived for centuries. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at King's Landing the same way again. The year was 2 AC, when Aegon the Conqueror looked upon the hills where three rivers met and declared this would be the heart of his new kingdom. But here's what most people don't realize. Aegon didn't just build a city. He built a monument to dragon supremacy that would echo through the ages long after the last dragon died. Every tower, every wall, every stone was placed with intention, carrying the weight of Targaryen ambition and the memory of Dragonfyre. The Red Keep stands as the most obvious testament to Targaryen power, but its secrets run deeper than anyone imagines. When Aegon commissioned Maegor the Cruel to complete the construction, he didn't just want a castle. He wanted a fortress that would psychologically dominate anyone who approached it. The towers were designed to mimic the necks of dragons, rising from the earth like sleeping giants. The red stone wasn't chosen randomly either. It was specifically selected because when the morning sun hits it, the entire structure glows like dragonfire, a daily reminder to the city below of who ruled from above. But here's where it gets really interesting. Recent archaeological studies have revealed that the Red Keep's foundations contain something extraordinary: actual dragonstone from Dragonstone Island. Not just any stone, but dragonstone that had been exposed to dragon breath for generations. This wasn't just practical construction, it was symbolic. The Targaryens were literally building their seat of power on the bones of their ancestral home, ensuring that the magic of old Valyria would forever be part of King's Landing's foundation. The throne room itself tells an even more fascinating story. The Iron Throne wasn't just placed randomly in that massive hall. The positioning was calculated to ensure that when the king sat upon it, natural light would frame him like a divine figure. The height of the ceiling, the width of the room, even the number of steps leading up to the throne, everything was designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant in the presence of dragon kings. The acoustic properties of the room were engineered so that the king's voice would carry with unnatural clarity, making every word sound like a pronouncement from the gods themselves. Moving beyond the Red Keep, we encounter the Dragonpit, a structure that most people today see as a ruin, but once stood as the most impressive building in all of Westeros. The Dragonpit wasn't just a stable for dragons, it was a cathedral dedicated to the power of House Targaryen. The dome was designed to be visible from every corner of King's Landing, a constant reminder that dragons watched over the city. The bronze doors were each as tall as a giant, decorated with scenes of Targaryen conquest that told the story of how fire and blood had united the Seven Kingdoms. The internal structure of the Dragon Pit reveals even more secrets. The chambers beneath the main dome were lined with dragonstone and featured channels that could carry dragonfire throughout the building. During important ceremonies, these channels would be lit, creating the illusion that the building itself was breathing fire. The psychological impact on visitors was immense. They weren't just entering a building, they were entering the mouth of a dragon. But the most incredible discovery about the Dragon Pit came when archaeologists found evidence of a massive underground complex beneath the ruins. This wasn't just storage space, it was a fully functioning dragon nursery. The temperature was regulated through a complex system of heated stones and fire channels. The walls were lined with shelves designed to hold dragon eggs, and the floor was covered in sand, imported from the beaches of Dragonstone. This underground facility could house dozens of developing dragons, suggesting that the Targaryens were planning for a future with far more dragons than history records. The transformation of the Dragonpit after the Dance of Dragons tells its own story about the fall of Targaryen power. When the dragons died out, the building couldn't simply be abandoned. It was too much a part of the city's identity. Instead, it was converted into a gladiatorial arena. But even this transformation carried Targaryen symbolism. The fighting pit was designed in the shape of a dragon's head when viewed from above, and the entrance tunnels were positioned to mimic the breathing passages of a dragon. Even in their diminished state, the Targaryens ensured that their legacy would be remembered every time blood was spilled in the sand. The walls of King's Landing themselves represent perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of Targaryen architectural legacy. Most people assume these walls were built purely for defense, but they served a much deeper purpose. The Targaryens understood that a city's walls don't just keep enemies out, they keep subjects in and create a sense of shared identity among those who live within them. The design of King's Landing's walls was revolutionary for its time, incorporating lessons learned from the great cities of Essos and the fortress cities of old Valyria. The foundation stones of these walls contain another surprise. They're not just regular stone. Embedded throughout the foundations are pieces of volcanic glass from Dragonstone, creating a barrier that would theoretically be resistant to Dragonfire. This wasn't just defensive planning, it was a statement. The Targaryens were saying that their city was so perfectly designed that even other dragons couldn't threaten it. The psychological impact of this knowledge on potential enemies cannot be overstated. The gates of the city were designed with equal care and symbolic meaning. The River Gate, the King's Gate, the God's Gate. Each was positioned not just for practical defense, but to control the flow of people and goods in ways that would benefit Targaryen rule. The River Gate, for instance, was positioned to ensure that all river traffic would have a clear view of the Red Keep, reminding traders and travelers of who controlled the city's prosperity. The King's Gate was designed to funnel visitors along a specific route that would showcase the city's wealth and order, creating a carefully orchestrated first impression of Targaryen rule. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the city's design was how it incorporated the natural landscape to reinforce Targaryen power. The three hills upon which the city was built, Aegon's High Hill, Rhaenys Hill, and Visenya's Hill, were not just named after the conquerors randomly. Each hill was developed to represent a different aspect of Targaryen rule. Aegon's High Hill, crowned by the Red Keep, represented political power. Rhaenys Hill, site of the Dragonpit, represented military might. Visenya's Hill, where the Sept of Remembrance was later built, represented the integration of old and new faiths under Targaryen rule. The street layout of King's Landing also reflects careful Targaryen planning. The major thoroughfares all lead ultimately to the Red Keep, creating a spider web of roads that naturally drew people toward the center of power. But more subtly, the streets were designed to prevent large groups from gathering in any single location except designated spaces that could be easily monitored from the Red Keep. The Targaryens had learned from the mob violence that had destroyed other great cities, and they built King's Landing to be resistant to popular uprising. The sewers and water systems of King's Landing represent another aspect of Targaryen engineering brilliance. The network of tunnels beneath the city wasn't just for waste management. It was designed to allow rapid movement of troops and supplies in times of crisis. More importantly, the water supply was controlled through a series of reservoirs and channels that could be cut off from the Red Keep if necessary. The Targaryens understood that controlling water meant controlling the city, and they built their infrastructure to maintain that control, even in the worst circumstances. As we explore these architectural marvels, we begin to understand that the Targaryens weren't just building a city. They were creating a living symbol of their dynasty that would endure long after their dragons were gone. But architecture is just the beginning of their hidden legacy. The cultural influences they embedded in King's Landing run even deeper, shaping the very soul of the city in ways that continue to this day. The question becomes, if the Targaryens put this much thought and symbolism into the stones and mortar of their city, what other secrets did they hide in plain sight? The answer will surprise you, and it's waiting in the culture, traditions, and bloodlines of King's Landing itself. Hidden in plain sight, Targaryen influences on King's Landing culture. Every festival, every tradition, every story told in the taverns of King's Landing carries the invisible fingerprint of the Dragon Kings. While most people think Targaryen influence disappeared with the last dragon, the truth is far more fascinating. The cultural DNA of the Targaryens didn't vanish. It transformed, evolved, and embedded itself so deeply into the fabric of daily life that it became invisible to those who lived it every day. The dragon dances performed during harvest festivals aren't just entertainment. They're living memories of actual dragon ceremonies that once took place in the Dragonpit. Historical records show that during the height of Targaryen power, these weren't dances at all, but carefully choreographed rituals designed to honor the dragons and maintain the mystical connection between the royal family and their ancient beasts. The dancers wore costumes made from actual dragon scales, and the movements they performed were based on observations of real dragon flight patterns and mating displays. What's absolutely incredible is how these ceremonies evolved after the dragons died. The people of King's Landing couldn't simply abandon traditions that had become part of their identity, so they transformed them into something new while keeping the essential elements alive. The dragon dances became more elaborate, more artistic, but the underlying structure remained the same. Even today, if you watch carefully, you can see movements that mimic the wing beats of Valyrian the Black Dread, or the serpentine neck movements of Vagar. The dancers don't know they're performing a 300-year-old dragon ritual, but they are. The music that accompanies these dances tells an even more remarkable story. Musicologists have discovered that the traditional songs sung during King's Landing festivals contain fragments of high Valyrian incantations that were once used to communicate with dragons. The melodies themselves are based on the harmonic frequencies that dragons responded to most strongly. In essence, every time the people of King's Landing celebrate with these traditional songs, they're singing in the ancient language of dragon tamers, calling out to creatures that no longer exist. But perhaps the most persistent cultural influence lies in the city's relationship with fire itself. The Targaryens didn't just bring dragons to Westeros. They brought an entirely different understanding of fire as a sacred element. This belief system seeped into every aspect of King's Landing culture, from the way blacksmiths approach their work to the rituals performed in the city's many temples. The Great Sept of Baelor, despite being dedicated to the Seven, incorporates architectural elements and ceremonial practices that can be traced directly back to Valyrian fire worship. The influence becomes even more apparent when you examine the city's blacksmithing traditions. The techniques used by the armorers and weaponsmiths of King's Landing aren't just practical craftsmanship. They're based on methods developed specifically for working with Valyrian steel. Even though true Valyrian steel can no longer be forged, the fundamental approaches to metalwork in King's Landing still follow principles established by Targaryen master smiths. The way fires are built, the types of coal used, even the prayers spoken over the forge, all of these practices can be traced back to the Dragon Kings. The presence of Valyrian steel weapons in King's Landing represents one of the most tangible connections to Targaryen rule. These aren't just valuable swords, they're religious artifacts that carry the weight of an entire civilization. Each Valyrian steel blade in the city tells a story of conquest, reward, or political maneuvering during the Targaryen era. The fact that these weapons are still treasured and passed down through generations shows how deeply the values of the Dragon Kings penetrated into the aristocracy of King's Landing. Ice, the ancestral sword of House Stark, spent decades in King's Landing during the Targaryen period. and its presence influenced an entire generation of nobles. The sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of the old ways, a reminder that the Targaryens had united not just the kingdoms, but their ancient traditions as well. When young nobles would see ice displayed in the Red Keep, they weren't just looking at a sword, they were seeing a piece of history that connected them to the age of heroes and the first men. The influence of Valyrian steel extended beyond the weapons themselves to the entire culture of blade work in King's Landing. The way knights trained, the techniques they valued, even the ceremonies surrounding knighthood, all of these were shaped by the presence of these magical weapons. The Targaryens understood that controlling not just the weapons, but the knowledge of how to use them was key to maintaining power. They established training methods and fighting styles that would remain dominant long after their dynasty fell. Marriage customs in King's Landing also bear the hidden mark of Targaryen influence. The practice of political marriages, the elaborate wedding ceremonies, even the specific vows spoken during noble weddings, all of these were shaped by Targaryen traditions that blended Valyrian customs with the existing practices of Westeros. The Targaryens didn't just marry for love, or even just for political advantage. They married to create mystical connections between bloodlines, believing that certain combinations of ancestry would produce children with special abilities. This belief in the power of bloodlines created a marriage culture in King's Landing that was unlike anywhere else in Westeros. Noble families would spend generations planning matches that would strengthen not just their political positions, but their connections to the old magic of Valyria. These weren't just arranged marriages, they were attempts to breed the next generation of rulers who might be capable of bonding with dragons if the beasts ever returned. The Targaryen practice of sibling marriage, while shocking to most of Westeros, left its mark on King's Landing's understanding of family relationships. Even families who never practiced incest themselves began to view family bonds as more sacred and politically significant than they had before. The intensity of family loyalty expected in King's Landing noble houses can be traced directly to Targaryen influence, as can the willingness of families to sacrifice individual happiness for dynastic goals. Religious practices in King's Landing also show clear signs of Targaryen influence, despite the family's official conversion to the faith of the Seven. The Targaryens never fully abandoned their Valyrian beliefs. They simply layered new traditions on top of old ones. This created a unique religious culture in King's Landing, where the Seven were worshipped alongside subtle acknowledgements of older, more mysterious powers. The eternal flames maintained in various temples throughout the city aren't just symbols of the Seven, they're continuations of the sacred fires of old Valyria. The Sept of Remembrance, built on Visenya's Hill, represents the most obvious example of this religious blending. While officially dedicated to the Seven, the building incorporates architectural elements and ceremonial spaces that can only be understood as references to Valyrian fire worship. The positioning of the altar, the design of the windows, even the types of incense burned during ceremonies, all of these elements show how the Targaryens successfully merged their ancient beliefs with the dominant religion of their new kingdom. Prophecy and fortune-telling became much more significant in King's Landing culture during the Targaryen period. The Dragon Kings brought with them a deep belief in the power of dreams and visions, and this belief spread throughout the city. The network of fortune-tellers, dream interpreters and mystics that operated in King's Landing during this period created a culture where prophecy was taken seriously by people at all levels of society. This wasn't just superstition. It was a systematic approach to understanding and influencing the future that the Targaryens had developed over centuries. The influence of Targaryen prophecy culture can still be seen in King's Landing today. The way people interpret omens, the significance placed on unusual dreams, the tendency to look for hidden meanings in everyday events. All of these characteristics of King's Landing culture can be traced back to the Dragon King's belief in the power of prophecy. The Targaryens understood that controlling how people think about the future is just as important as controlling their present circumstances. Language itself was transformed by Targaryen rule. High Valyrian words and phrases became integrated into the common tongue as spoken in King's Landing, creating a dialect that was distinct from the language used in other parts of Westeros. These weren't just borrowed words, they were concepts that didn't exist in Westerosi culture before the Targaryens arrived. Ideas about honor, power, family, and destiny that could only be expressed in High Valyrian became part of how people in King's Landing understood themselves and their place in the world. The influence extended to naming conventions as well. The Targaryens popularized certain types of names that carried Valyrian meanings, and these names spread throughout the noble and merchant classes of King's Landing. Parents would choose names not just for their sound, but for their connection to the old magic of Valyria. Having a name with Valyrian roots became a mark of sophistication and connection to power that persisted long after the Targaryens fell. Trade and commerce in King's Landing also bear the mark of Targaryen influence. The Dragon Kings established trade relationships with Essos that brought new goods, new ideas, and new ways of doing business to their capital city. The merchant culture that developed in King's Landing was unlike anything seen elsewhere in Westeros, combining local traditions with practices learned from the great trading cities of Essos. The Targaryens understood that economic power was just as important as military might, and they built a commercial culture that would support their rule for generations. The influence of Essosi culture brought by the Targaryens can be seen in everything from the spices used in King's Landing cuisine to the fabrics favored by the nobility. These weren't just exotic imports. They were markers of a cosmopolitan culture that the Targaryens deliberately cultivated to set their capital apart from the rest of Westeros. The food, clothing, and luxury goods available in King's Landing during the Targaryen period created a lifestyle that was both uniquely Westerosi and deeply connected to the broader world across the Narrow Sea. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Targaryen cultural influence is how it survived the fall of the dynasty itself. The rebellion that brought down the Dragon Kings couldn't erase 3 centuries of cultural development. The traditions, beliefs, and practices that had become part of King's Landing's identity simply adapted to new circumstances while maintaining their essential character. The city that Robert Baratheon inherited wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a living repository of Targaryen culture that continued to shape how people lived, worked, and understood themselves. As we begin to understand the depth of this cultural influence, we must ask, if Targaryen beliefs and practices became so deeply embedded in King's Landing culture, what happened to the people who carried Targaryen blood? The answer lies not in the noble houses or the historical records, but in the common folk who walk the streets of King's Landing every day, unveiling the Targaryen blood in the common folk. The most shocking secret of King's Landing isn't hidden in ancient texts or buried beneath castle foundations. It's walking the streets every single day, selling fish in the markets, working in the taverns, and living ordinary lives without ever knowing they carry the blood of dragons. The true extent of Targaryen influence on King's Landing's population is a story that has been deliberately hidden, forgotten, and ignored by historians who prefer to focus on the rise and fall of kings rather than the survival of bloodlines. The Blackfyre rebellion of 196 AC marked more than just a failed attempt to claim the Iron Throne. It represented a seismic shift in how Targaryen blood was distributed throughout the population of King's Landing. When Demon Blackfyre gathered his supporters, he wasn't just calling upon ambitious lords and knights. he was appealing to a network of people throughout the city who carried Targaryen blood through unofficial channels, bastard lines, and forgotten marriages that had been accumulating for nearly 2 centuries. What most people don't realize is that the Blackfyre rebellion wasn't crushed, it was absorbed. When Daemon fell at the Battle of the Redgrass Field, his supporters didn't simply disappear. They melted back into the population of King's Landing, carrying their dragon blood with them into the growing mass of common folk. The victorious Targaryens made a calculated decision not to hunt down every Blackfyre supporter, understanding that doing so would require killing or exiling a significant portion of their own capital's population. The aftermath of the rebellion created something unprecedented in Westerosi history, a large population of people with royal blood living as commoners. These weren't just distant relatives or theoretical connections. These were people whose grandparents or great-grandparents had been acknowledged bastards of Targaryen kings, or who descended from the numerous minor nobles who had married into Targaryen bloodlines over the centuries. The rebellion's failure forced them to abandon their claims to nobility, but it couldn't erase their heritage. The genetic legacy of this hidden population is remarkable. Studies of King's Landing's common folk during the later Targaryen period reveal an unusually high incidence of the physical characteristics associated with Valyrian blood. Silver blonde hair, violet eyes, and the distinctive bone structure of old Valyria appeared with surprising frequency among people who had no official connection to the royal family. These weren't random genetic anomalies. They were the visible signs of a hidden dragon bloodline that had been growing in the shadows for generations. The most fascinating aspect of this hidden heritage is how it influenced the culture and politics of King's Landing in ways that nobody recognized at the time. The people who carried Targaryen blood, even unknowingly, tended to gravitate toward positions and professions that connected them to their ancestral legacy. They became blacksmiths specializing in fine metalwork, artists creating works with dragon motifs, merchants dealing in goods from Essos, and tavern keepers who somehow always knew the old songs and stories better than anyone else. The concentration of hidden Targaryen blood in certain neighborhoods of King's Landing created distinct cultural pockets that maintained traditions and practices that had been lost elsewhere. Flea Bottom, despite its reputation as the poorest part of the city, became a repository of authentic Valyrian culture that was more pure in some ways than what existed in the Red Keep itself. The common folk who lived there weren't performing for political advantage or following court fashion. They were living the culture that was genuinely part of their heritage. The influence of this hidden bloodline extended to the city's religious practices as well. The Sept of Baelor saw an unusual number of commoners who demonstrated an instinctive understanding of the more esoteric aspects of religious ritual. These weren't learned scholars or trained septons. They were ordinary people who somehow knew prayers, gestures, and ceremonies that weren't taught in common religious instruction. The explanation lies in the fact that they were carrying genetic memories of the blended religious traditions that the Targaryens had developed over centuries. The economic impact of hidden Targaryen blood in King's Landing was equally significant. The common folk who carried this heritage demonstrated an unusual aptitude for trade, negotiation, and economic planning that gave them advantages in the city's competitive commercial environment. They weren't just lucky or particularly clever. They were inheriting the same instincts for power and strategy that had made their ancestors successful rulers. This created a merchant class in King's Landing that was unusually sophisticated and internationally connected. The marriage patterns among King's Landing's common folk also show clear signs of hidden Targaryen influence. People with dragon blood, even when they didn't know they had it, tended to seek out partners who shared similar characteristics. This wasn't conscious genetic selection. It was an instinctive recognition of shared heritage that operated below the level of conscious awareness. The result was a gradual concentration of Targaryen blood in certain family lines that became stronger with each generation. The most remarkable evidence of this hidden heritage can be found in the city's records of unusual births. Children born with distinctive Valyrian features appeared with statistically impossible frequency among the common folk of King's Landing. These weren't just random genetic variations. They were the expression of recessive traits that had been carried in the population for generations. The fact that these children often demonstrated unusual intelligence, charisma, or other gifts associated with Targaryen blood suggests that the genetic legacy was about more than just physical appearance. The survival skills demonstrated by King's Landing's population during times of crisis also point to hidden Targaryen influence. The common folk showed an unusual ability to organize, adapt, and survive challenges that devastated other cities. This wasn't just luck or local knowledge. It was the expression of the same survival instincts that had allowed the Targaryens to survive the doom of Valyria and conquer Westeros. The dragon blood in the population provided a genetic foundation for resilience that served the city well during its darkest hours. The artistic and cultural achievements of King's Landing's common folk during the Targaryen period were extraordinary by any standard. Songs, stories, crafts, and performances that emerged from the city's taverns and markets displayed a sophistication and creativity that rivaled the work of trained court artists. This wasn't just natural talent. It was the expression of the same creative gifts that had made the Targaryens master builders, strategists, and rulers. The hidden dragon blood in the population created a cultural renaissance that operated parallel to the official court culture. The political instincts of King's Landing's common folk also reflected their hidden heritage. Despite having no formal education in governance or politics, the population demonstrated an unusual understanding of power dynamics, strategic thinking, and long-term planning. They weren't just reacting to events. They were anticipating them with the same instinctive political intelligence that had made the Targaryens successful rulers. This created a population that was unusually sophisticated in its approach to urban politics and social organization. The linguistic patterns of King's Landing's common folk provide another window into their hidden heritage. The dialect that developed in the city incorporated not just borrowed words from High Valyrian, but grammatical structures and conceptual frameworks that could only come from people who had internalized the language at a deep level. This wasn't just cultural influence, it was the expression of genetic memory that allowed people to understand and use linguistic patterns they had never been formally taught. The military capabilities of King's Landing's common folk during times of crisis also reflected their hidden Targaryen heritage. When the city was threatened, the population demonstrated an unusual ability to organize effective resistance, develop innovative tactics, and maintain morale under pressure. These weren't just learned skills. They were the expression of the same military instincts that had made the Targaryens successful conquerors. The dragon blood in the population provided a genetic foundation for martial excellence that served the city well. The most intriguing aspect of this hidden heritage is how it influenced the city's relationship with the Targaryen dynasty itself. The common folk of King's Landing demonstrated an unusual loyalty to the royal family that went beyond mere political convenience or economic dependence. This wasn't just cultural conditioning. It was the expression of genetic loyalty that operated at a subconscious level. The hidden dragon blood in the population created a bond with the ruling dynasty that was stronger and more enduring than any based purely on political calculation. The evidence for widespread Targaryen blood among King's Landing's common folk becomes even more compelling when we examine the city's response to the fall of the dynasty. Unlike other cities that quickly adapted to new rulers, King's Landing showed a persistent loyalty to Targaryen memory and tradition that couldn't be explained by political or economic factors alone. The population continued to tell dragon stories, maintain dragon traditions, and hope for dragon return with an intensity that suggested personal rather than just cultural investment. The most shocking discovery about King's Landing's hidden dragon blood comes from genealogical research conducted during the later Targaryen period. Court records show that nearly 30% of the city's population could trace their lineage back to acknowledged or suspected Targaryen bastards. This wasn't just distant connection. These were people whose great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents had carried royal blood. The concentration was so high that King's Landing had effectively become a repository of Targaryen genetics that was more diverse and numerous than the official royal family itself. The implications of this hidden heritage extend far beyond historical curiosity. The people walking the streets of King's Landing today may not know it, but they carry within them the genetic legacy of the most powerful dynasty in Westerosi history. Their instincts, their talents, their dreams, and their destinies are all shaped by dragon blood that flows through their veins. And as we'll discover, this hidden heritage may be the key to understanding not just King's Landing's past, but its future as well. The Targaryen shadow, unseen influence on King's Landing's destiny. The Iron Throne sits empty. The dragons are gone, and the Targaryen dynasty has fallen, but their influence on King's Landing's destiny continues to operate with the same inexorable force that once drove their conquest of Westeros. The most profound secret of the Dragon Kings isn't what they built or who they ruled, but how they wove themselves so completely into the fabric of fate itself that King's Landing remains a Targaryen city even when ruled by other houses. The threads of destiny they set in motion 3 centuries ago are still pulling the city toward conclusions that most people can't see coming. The Iron Throne represents far more than a seat of power. It's a mystical anchor that connects whoever sits upon it to the vast network of prophecy, magic, and destiny that the Targaryens spent centuries developing. The 1,000 swords that make up the throne weren't just melted together by Dragonfire. They were transformed into a single magical artifact that channels the will and wisdom of every king who has ever ruled from it. The throne doesn't just make kings, it makes them into extensions of Targaryen purpose, whether they realize it or not. The positioning of the Iron Throne within the Red Keep wasn't chosen randomly. The exact location sits at the convergence of several ley lines that the Targaryens identified using ancient Valyrian knowledge of magical geography. These aren't just theoretical lines of power. They're actual channels through which magical energy flows across the continent. By placing their seat of power at this convergence point, the Targaryens ensured that anyone who ruled from King's Landing would be connected to the same sources of mystical power that had made their dynasty successful. The influence of these magical connections extends far beyond the throne room itself. The entire city of King's Landing was built according to principles of mystical architecture that the Targaryens had learned from the sorcerers of old Valyria. The street patterns, the positioning of major buildings, even the flow of water through the city. All of these elements were designed to channel magical energy in ways that would strengthen Targaryen rule and influence the destiny of everyone who lived within the city walls. The most remarkable aspect of this mystical design is how it continues to operate even after the Targaryens have fallen. The magical architecture of King's Landing doesn't depend on having a Targaryen on the throne. It was designed to influence whoever holds power in the city, gradually shaping their decisions and actions to align with Targaryen purposes. Robert Baratheon thought he was ruling as a Baratheon, but the magical influence of the city was slowly transforming him into something closer to a Targaryen king. The prophecy of the prince that was promised represents the most ambitious aspect of Targaryen destiny manipulation. This isn't just an ancient prediction, it's a carefully constructed mystical program that the Targaryens developed over centuries to ensure their return to power. The prophecy wasn't discovered by the Targaryens, it was created by them, using techniques learned from the most advanced magical practitioners of old Valyria. Every element of the prophecy, from the circumstances of the prince's birth to the signs that would herald his coming, was designed to ensure that when the time came, a Targaryen would be perfectly positioned to fulfill it. The genius of the prophecy lies not just in its content, but in its distribution. The Targaryens didn't keep the prophecy secret. They spread it throughout the known world, embedding it in the religious traditions, cultural practices, and folk beliefs of dozens of different peoples. By the time the prophecy was needed, it would be impossible to trace back to its Targaryen origins. The entire world would be watching for the prince that was promised, not realizing they were participating in a Targaryen plan that had been set in motion centuries earlier. The magical bloodlines that the Targaryens cultivated through their marriage practices were designed to ensure that when the prophecy was fulfilled, it would be fulfilled by someone with the genetic and mystical capabilities necessary to restore dragon power to the world. The practice of sibling marriage wasn't just about keeping bloodlines pure, it was about concentrating magical abilities that would be needed for the challenges ahead. The Targaryens understood that the prince that was promised would need to be more than just a political leader. He would need to be a magical practitioner capable of reawakening the ancient powers that had been dormant since the doom of Valyria. The network of dragon eggs that the Targaryens distributed throughout the world represents another aspect of their long-term planning. These weren't just valuable artifacts or symbols of power. They were mystical seeds that would remain dormant until the right combination of circumstances awakened them. The Targaryens understood that the return of dragons wouldn't happen by chance. It would require careful preparation and the right bloodline to trigger the awakening. Every dragon egg that survived the fall of the dynasty was a potential catalyst for the restoration of dragon power. The influence of Targaryen destiny manipulation can be seen in the series of seemingly random events that led to the survival of the last Targaryen heirs. The fall of King's Landing, the escape of Viserys and Daenerys, their eventual separation, and the chain of events that led to the hatching of the dragon eggs, none of these were truly random occurrences. They were the result of mystical influences that the Targaryens had built into the very foundations of their dynasty, ensuring that even their apparent destruction would contain the seeds of their eventual return. The role of King's Landing in this grand design cannot be overstated. The city wasn't just the capital of the Targaryen Empire. It was the mystical heart of a magical system that encompassed the entire known world. The fall of the Targaryens didn't destroy this system. It simply shifted it into a different phase of operation. The city continues to function as a mystical beacon, drawing people, events, and circumstances that will eventually lead to the fulfillment of Targaryen destiny. The hidden dragon blood among King's Landing's population isn't just a genetic curiosity, it's a strategic resource that the Targaryens built into their capital city to ensure they would always have allies and supporters when they needed them most. The people who carry this blood don't just have Targaryen physical characteristics. They have Targaryen instincts, Targaryen dreams, and Targaryen destinies. When the time comes for the dragons to return, these people will be drawn to support the restoration, not because they've been convinced by political arguments, but because their own genetic programming compels them to do so. The economic and political structures of King's Landing also reflect Targaryen destiny planning. The city's position as the center of trade, its connections to the free cities, its role in continental politics, all of these elements were designed to ensure that when the Targaryens returned, They would find a city that was already integrated into the kind of international power structure they would need to re-establish their empire. The fall of the dynasty didn't destroy these connections. It simply transferred them to other rulers who unknowingly maintained the infrastructure that would eventually serve Targaryen purposes. The religious landscape of King's Landing shows clear signs of Targaryen mystical influence as well. The various temples, septs, and holy sites throughout the city weren't just built to serve the spiritual needs of the population. They were positioned according to mystical principles that would enhance the magical power of the city and its rulers. The faith of the Seven, the followers of Rahala, the various mystery cults, all of these religious traditions were subtly influenced by Targaryen, planning to ensure they would eventually converge in support of the prophesied return of the dragons. The most profound aspect of Targaryen destiny manipulation is how it operates across generations, shaping the lives and choices of people who have no conscious connection to the Dragon Kings. The blacksmiths who maintain the traditions of metalworking, the merchants who preserve trade connections with Essos, the artists who keep alive the cultural traditions. All of these people are unknowingly participating in a grand design that will eventually restore Targaryen power to the world. The military traditions of King's Landing also reflect this long-term planning. The city's approach to defense, the training of its guards, the design of its fortifications, all of these elements were created not just to protect the city from immediate threats, but to ensure that when the dragons returned, they would find a population that was already prepared for the kind of warfare that would be necessary to re-establish the Targaryen Empire. The hidden dragon blood among the population provides a genetic foundation for military excellence that will be activated when the time comes. The educational and cultural institutions of King's Landing serve a similar function in the grand design. The libraries, the maesters, the various schools and academies, all of these were established or influenced by the Targaryens to preserve the knowledge and skills that would be needed for the restoration. The people who study in these institutions don't realize they're being prepared for roles in a future Targaryen empire. But that's exactly what's happening. The most remarkable evidence of ongoing Targaryen influence on King's Landing's destiny is how the city continues to be the center of major historical events even after the fall of the dynasty. The War of the Five Kings, the various political upheavals, the religious conflicts, all of these events seem to be drawn to King's Landing as if by some invisible force. The city remains the focal point of Westerosi history because the Targaryens designed it to be a mystical magnet that would attract the people and events necessary for the fulfillment of their destiny. As we reach the end of our exploration of the hidden Targaryen legacy in King's Landing, we must confront the most startling conclusion of all. The story of the Dragon Kings isn't over. Everything we've discovered, the architectural legacy, the cultural influences, the hidden bloodlines, the mystical manipulations, all of these elements are still active, still working toward the same goal that the Targaryens set for themselves 3 centuries ago. King's Landing remains a Targaryen city, and the dragons will return, because the Targaryens built their return into the very foundations of their capital. The whispers of Westeros carry more than just rumors and gossip. They carry the echoes of a dynasty that never truly fell, a bloodline that never truly died, and a destiny that remains unfulfilled. The hidden Targaryen legacy in King's Landing isn't just history. It's prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. And when that fulfillment comes, the world will finally understand that the Dragon Kings didn't just conquer Westeros, they conquered time itself, ensuring that their rule would be eternal, their influence unending, and their return inevitable. The fire and blood of House Targaryen lives on in every stone, every tradition, every beating heart in King's Landing. The dragons may be gone, but their city remains, and with it, the promise that fire and blood will rise again.